Please be seated. Welcome. We are continuing our focus on the book of Revelation tonight with a story inspired by Revelation 20 and the lake of fire that it speaks of. The story was originally written by Reverend Bruce Van Blair and then modified by Eric with Bruce's permission and presented at Countryside 10 years ago. Tonight we are revisiting this story just as we revisited the churches of Revelation in our last series. Let us begin our Lenten journey with a prayer. This is a prayerful poem called Blessing the Dust by Jan Richardson. She wrote a book called Painted Prayer Book. All those days you felt like dust, like dirt, as if all you had to do was turn your face toward the wind and be scattered to the four corners or swept away by the smallest breath as insubstantial. Did you not know what the Holy One can do with dust? This is the day we freely say we are scorched. This is the hour we are marked by what has made it through the burning. This is the moment we ask for the blessing that lives within the ancient ashes, that makes its home inside the soil of this sacred earth. So let us be marked, not for sorrow, and let us be marked not for shame. Let us be marked not for false humility or for thinking that we are less than we are, but for claiming what God can do. Within the dust, within the dirt, within the stuff of which the world is made, and the stars that blaze in our bones, and the galaxies that spiral inside the smudge we bear. Amen. From Revelation 20. When the 1,000 years are up, Satan will be let loose from himself and will launch again his old work of deceiving the nations, searching out victims in every nook and cranny of earth, every cog and magog. He'll talk them into going to war and will gather a huge army, millions strong. They'll stream across the earth, surround and lay siege to the camp of God's holy people, the beloved city. They'll no sooner get there than fire will pour out of heaven and burn them up. The devil who deceives them will be hurled into lake fire and brimstone, joining the beast and the false prophet, the three in torment around the clock for ages without end. I saw a great white throne and the one enthroned. Nothing could stand before or against the presence, nothing in heaven, nothing on earth. And then I saw all the dead, great and small, standing there before the throne. And books were opened. Then another book was opened, the book of life. The dead were judged by what was written in the books, by the way that they had lived. Sea released its dead. Death and hell turned in their dead. Each man and woman was judged by the way he or she had lived. Then death and hell were hurled into lake fire. This is the second death, lake fire. Anyone whose name was not found inscribed in the book of life was hurled into lake fire. I saw heaven and earth, new created. Gone the first heaven, gone the first earth, gone the sea. I saw holy Jerusalem, newly created, descending resplendent out of heaven, as ready for God as a bride for her husband. I heard a voice thunder from the throne. Look, look, God has moved into the neighborhood, making God's home with men and women. They're God's people. God is their God. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death is gone for good. Tears gone, crying gone, pain gone. All the first order of things gone. The enthroned continued. Look, I am making everything new. Write it all down, each word dependable and accurate.
My name is Ralph. I am from Scottsdale, Arizona. You look all like a church-going crowd. Is that right? They say in Scottsdale, ministers say that it's really hard to do ministry there because it's so doggone beautiful that heaven doesn't entice them, and it's so doggone hot in the summers that hell doesn't scare them. Well, this is a story that has something to do with heaven and hell, but maybe not in the way you expect. You see, I'm dead. I was 52 years old when I died. They said it was a real shame. He was so young. God only takes the best, is what my church friends said. He had such a wonderful career ahead of him, and oh, his wife and his children, beautiful children. And for the first few days, I'll tell you, I was in a state of shock myself. I'd been so stupid, so careless. You see, there was this palm tree in my backyard behind my pool, next to the fence going out to the alley. And I was grousing about it being all overgrown to my 85-year-old neighbor one day. I didn't want to call a professional just to trim one tree. He said he trimmed his own trees back in the day up until he was 65 years old, and he had 6 out back. He offered to give me his old equipment if I wanted to do it myself. Said that I could have it, keep it, be glad to be put to good use. Well, the next weekend, I stopped next door to pick up the equipment. I was anxious and distracted. My honeydew list included not only that palm tree, but a big load of rock that had been dumped out front that I was supposed to have spread last weekend. That meant this weekend both had to be done, and I don't work on Sundays. That's out of the question. We're churchgoers. We try to avoid working on the Sabbath. Besides, my conservative Bible church was holding a potluck and an annual meeting after worship, followed by the men's fellowship Sunday meeting. And the church evangelism board was meeting that evening too, and since I was the chair, I kind of had to be there. So with Sunday so packed, it was get the honeydews done Saturday or live in the doghouse the next weekend. I need to confess that part of my reason for being so anxious and distracted when I picked up my neighbor's old equipment was due to an argument I'd had with my wife the night before. We'd fought over whether or not we could afford to send our eldest son on the church's youth mission trip to Peru. Money's kind of been tight, and Dahlia couldn't see the reasoning behind spending $1,500 per youth to send the youth down to Peru to build a couple of houses. She said if we just sent $500 down there, they could build their own houses with money to spare. Well, I put my foot down on that one. She knew perfectly well that building houses was a way to get into the hearts of the poor Peruvians. The kids were going down there to witness to them about Jesus Christ. What's the price of just one saved soul? I eventually yelled at Dahlia, appalled by her lack of compassion. She tried to use that old, but most of them are Catholics argument, as if we both didn't know where Catholics are going. So, with our argument still swirling in my head and the pressure to get started on the day, I got out my neighbor's garage as quickly as possible, even though I could tell he was kind of lonely and wanted to talk. Without paying too much attention, I put on the spiky shoes used to scramble up palm trees and looped the leather belt around my waist and the tree. And before I knew it, I'd made it all the way up to the top of that palm and was ready to trim. Now, it wasn't a particularly tall palm, but it was high enough to see into my neighbor's yards. It's amazing how people keep their yards when they're all behind walls and people don't think you can see in there. Anyway, my amusement only added to my distraction as I reached for my machete and took my first whack at those palm fronds. As soon as my machete hit the first frond, I discovered my mistake. I hadn't really considered the strength of that leather around my waist, the well-worn leather that had been sitting in my neighbor's garage for the last 20 years. That extra pressure against it when I took that first swing was enough to snap the leather, and I fell back. Jesus Christ were my last two words I uttered, but not exactly in praise or supplication. I didn't have far to fall. I suppose that if I had fallen on the ground, I might have gotten away with a couple of broken bones, but there was that pesky wall separating my backyard from the alley. The middle of my back landed squarely on top of that wall, snapping it instantly like a twig. A few breaths later, I was dead. For the first several weeks after my death, my interest and attention was pretty much focused on the people and events on earth. I found that if I focused on a person I knew and loved, I could get into their minds, their hearts, their feelings, almost as if I was them. I couldn't control people, but I could feel and perceive and understand what they were going through and what they were thinking. What I found surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I was loved. It was amazing the way people were grieving for me. Naturally, my wife and children took it hard, but so did others. My neighbor was really having a hard time of it. The guilt he experienced over having given me his equipment was mind-blowing. I'd always thought of him as a gruff old guy that needed to be saved one day. I mean, after all, he attended a United Church of Christ church. Anyway, I discovered that he was more shy than gruff. And even though he approved of my beliefs about as much as I approved of his, he admired me and my family. He saw me as a devoted husband and a loving father. I reminded him faintly of his own son, who had been killed in Vietnam. He had urged his son not to burn his draft card, which sent him to Vietnam, and he'd urged me to use his equipment, which sent me to my grave. I wanted somehow to reach out and tell him, listen, it's okay. I'm really not doing badly at all. In fact, I'm fine. My family will be fine too. You're not a bad person because of what happened. You're not a bad person at all. I was both heartened and surprised when I connected with my friends. What surprised me was that all those flaws that I thought were just kind of, well, hidden, were actually quite transparent to those who knew me well. All the self-righteousness, the envy, the pride, the self-centeredness that I thought was just a matter between me and God was actually quite evident to my friends. But they still loved me. They still respected and admired me. They still cared about me. I was in awe. If only I had known about this when I was alive, I would have been less superficial with people, knowing that they loved me despite my faults. And I think I would have been more graceful about dealing with other people's shortcomings, knowing they were doing the same with me. Of course, not everything I found was so touching. For instance, my wife thought that I still resented the fact that she had decided to go back to school for her MBA. Yes, I'd put up a fuss at first. I'd cited to the Bible even where it says that a wife should be subordinate to her husband, so it wasn't right that she should have an advanced degree. But I shortly saw how she yearned to grow intellectually and in her career. Going back to school was a perfect opportunity for her. I changed my heart and told her so, but I guess I never really let that support show very much, at least not as much as I thought. Worse, my son had very little concept of how much I loved him. He felt like a failure in my eyes, like he was never good enough. That mission trip I had him going on, the only reason why he was going was to please me. He'd already made up his mind that no matter what happened, he'd come back with stories of all the people he'd converted to Jesus Christ and the victory stories he'd share with me. my son harbored secrets as well. He'd done some things that convinced him beyond a shadow of a doubt that if I ever found out about them, I wouldn't love him anymore. He suspected that God already didn't love him. Part of him wondered if God had used my death as a way of punishing him for his sins. I could hardly bear the shame and torment he was experiencing. I wished I'd shown him clearly that nothing could separate him from my love. Perhaps he wouldn't have been so convinced that he'd separated himself from God's love. And there were other people who I thought were my friends who really had no care for me at all. Two of my co-workers' biggest concerns were which one would get my corner office. A couple of my men's fellowship friends were more concerned about whether my family would continue to pay our tithe than anything else. I quickly learned to tune out those people. It was really only the people who I loved and cared about most that I could tune into easily anyway. Others came in more like a radio station, not quite set on the exact frequency. As time passed, not that I experienced time in the usual sense, I found myself becoming gradually less interested in what was happening here on earth. It wasn't that I loved my family or friends any less, mind you. I just kind of began to understand where they and others were coming from, and through them, kind of the state of humanity itself spiritually. After a while, it just simply wasn't very interesting anymore. I wondered if maybe this was part of God's plan to gradually wean us off of life on earth in a gentle way. So as I began to lose interest in the earthly realm, my focus began to shift to the realm in which I found myself. I discovered that there were other people around me, plenty of them. My perception was a bit fuzzy at first, though. I guessed it was kind of like perceiving almost like a newborn baby would look out at the world. Nothing appeared too clear. I could make out people around me, but at first I couldn't see details. We communicated without speaking, through our thoughts and feelings. At first, I found it hard to lock in and tune into these people than it was to tune into people on earth. Harder that way, but I could focus on their thoughts and feelings only for a few minutes before having to retreat into myself out of sheer exhaustion at the concentration. I figured this was probably part of God's plan too. As our perception of our new realm becomes clearer, we're able to put our former lives into greater perspective. So God wants us to take time at first to reflect on our lives on earth, assessing what kind of people we were and what we gained from the experience before immersing ourselves in our new context. Certainly this was what was happening to me. I began to look over my life, and I must confess that my assessment wasn't a particularly flattering one. I'd never committed any great sins, never killed anybody. I was impeccably honest. I'd never done anything particularly bad in the eyes of the world, but I grew increasingly disappointed with what I found within myself beyond these superficialities. For instance, I saw clearly that my son's perception that I was judgmental was true. I loved him dearly, and because I loved him, I wanted to make sure that his eternal salvation in Jesus was assured. I was terrified he'd fall in with the wrong crowd and would hit that slippery slope that leads to moral relativism and eventually renunciation of saving faith. More often than I'd like to admit, I let fear guide my actions, not love. In fact, I saw clearly pretty much how most of my actions, even the most apparently loving and generous spirited ones, were based on fear instead of love. So-called generous acts toward many were really either attempts to show them how generous, spirited, and fun Christians could be so they'd eventually be converted and saved from hell, or were attempts to shore up my own faith so I could hang on to my sense of salvation. That youth trip to Peru, I wasn't sending my son down there to alleviate poverty. It was to save souls from hell and shore up his own faith. And tithing? Even though I spoke of how happy I was to be a tither, I secretly resented it. I started tithing because my church taught me that if you give God $1, God gives you far more than $1 back. I rarely saw faith equal riches. The only reason I kept tithing was because I was afraid not to. I think what I found most condemning, though, was my own hypocrisy with respect to sin. Well, don't get me wrong. Again, I wasn't one of those sleazy Christians who appear to live a squeaky clean life only to be caught in a no-tell motel or embezzling funds or snorting cocaine by the bagful. I really did live a squeaky clean lifestyle for the most part, but I resented that too. There were all kinds of things I wanted to do and never did because I was afraid God was looking over my shoulder. I really resented it when I'd heard someone who had lived an outrageous lifestyle suddenly coming to Jesus and being saved after they'd got to have all that fun. How I wished I could lose my faith and come to Christ in my last moments to cover all my sins. As I made these assessments of myself, I began to wonder about where all this was leading. I was beginning to realize that if God had judgment in store for me, I deserved it. I deserved it. That's when disappointment gave way to blood-curdling fear. I started wondering if maybe this process of self-assessment was something that God set up so that I would eventually agree with whatever terrible judgment and punishment God might have in store for me. I'd tell myself, hey, I'm not really that bad, and besides, I accepted Jesus as my personal Savior. That got me in, didn't it? Isn't that what my church taught me? What if they're wrong? What if my thoughts and actions proved that I only confessed Christ with my lips and not with my heart? Was I going to hell? I sought out other souls for answers. There were millions and millions of souls in this realm, whatever it was, wherever it was. I approached some of them asking, what's going on? Am I going to come to some terrible judgment? Each one would simply laugh and say, no, you have nothing to worry about. We're all in heaven. God has already made a judgment on you, and you've been found worthy. God is quite pleased with you. You can be assured of that, so don't worry. Some even said they'd seen Jesus, and most believed that Jesus would come again someday and live with them forever. They seemed so perfectly content with themselves, so self-assured. I couldn't relate. Something bothered me about my communications with these souls. Slowly, I began to realize that while I could communicate more clearly and effective than ever I could on earth once I got used to it, we also had the ability to shield certain thoughts and emotions from others. We weren't as transparent to each other as I'd originally imagined. We could simply perceive what the other person wanted us to perceive. And as I conversed more and more with these souls, I frequently encountered little snippets of a picture that was lingering far in the back of their minds. It was of something they had seen and stuck as far back in their consciousness as they could get so as not to cause disturbance. The image was of a lake of fire into which souls were being tossed. So this unsettling image of the lake of fire contrasted sharply with the happiness and self-assurance by those I encountered. But as I encountered more and more souls who told me about how wonderful it was to be in heaven, I kept encountering little glimpses of the lake, so many that I could piece together a pretty good picture of it without ever having seen it myself. Then one day I did see it, off in the distance. In this realm, distance is governed more by perception than space. But I saw the lake, and I heard the screams of souls who were being tossed into it. It was terrifying. With great urgency, I sought out those happy souls, saying, "Listen, you know this lake of fire. What is it? Why are people being thrown into it?" They all said, "Don't worry. This is where God puts sinners. It's not for you. You are in heaven." Well, I didn't know what to do. These souls seemed so confident of their salvation and so happy with themselves and each other. But what had struck in my mind was what I'd seen. It stuck there because I realized how utterly I had failed the test of life on earth. How could God possibly have weighed me in the balance and declared, "Yes, he is worthy, he deserves heaven"? I spent most of my life acting out of fear more than love. I accepted Jesus as my Savior more because I was afraid not to than anything else. Sometime later, I found myself suddenly quite close to that terrible and fiery lake. The screams of those people put a chill in my spine. They would scream this scream full of pain and regret and then disappear beneath the flames. Although I couldn't communicate with them, I could tap into their thoughts and feelings. And much to my horror, I found that they had made assessments of their lives like mine. They had reached the same sobering conclusion. They were not all worthy of heaven. Granted, some of them were grieving over having committed some pretty terrible acts of violence and betrayal, but not all of them. In fact, most were like me, giving God lip service, but never really having fallen in love. It was then that I realized that I absolutely did not belong where I was. I belonged out there, in that fiery lake. My heart turned cold toward God in that moment. I resented the fact that God would put people in such anguish for just having failed a test they never fully understood. I felt a strange peace in turning my back on God. But I have to confess that the haunting question arose shortly thereafter. Did that lake of fire utterly destroy a person, or did it keep burning and torturing a person for a very long time, for eternity, as people believed on earth? Well, I asked some of those other beings about this, and, well, they didn't exactly appreciate the question. They angrily struck back, "God is just and righteous. We don't make up the rules here. God does. If God has determined that they must suffer for eternity, who are we to question their damnation or our salvation? Jesus died for you and me." Just then I got an incredibly clear notion of Jesus on the cross. It was so bright, like 1,000 suns lit up. That image set my heart ablaze for a fraction of a second and then disappeared as quickly as it had come. Well, it was, I don't know, maybe years later, after my experience of that lake of fire, that I found myself there once again on its shore. I watched the souls plunge into the fire, heard their screams, felt their pain. And then I noticed just a few yards up from the shore from me, was a being unlike any human. He looked at me and asked, "What are you doing on the shores of these waters? Why are you not with the rest?" I stood there silently for what seemed like an eternity. I wanted to be absolutely clear about how I felt before responding. Then I said it. I'm for the lake. I am not like these happy ones. In fact, I care more and more about those who are out there, and I want nothing to do with the God who would put them there. I do not know what punishment lies in store, but I want to be where they are, for they are my people. I am one of them. The being didn't move, but I saw a glimmer in his eye, and suddenly I found myself thrown out into the middle of that lake. The searing pain caused me to scream out, and then I started falling. I was surrounded by flame on all sides of me, falling. The flames seemed to burn on the outside and the inside, burning. I found that they hurt, but they didn't hurt as much as I had imagined. And they kept burning. I kept falling, like time was standing still. As those flames licked against and through me, I found myself strangely getting happier, not sadder. I found that after a while, my face broke out into this brilliant smile. I couldn't make it go away. The weight was lifting, the pain, the frustration, the despair, all lifting, being burnt away. The shame I felt, being burnt away, like so much chaff. And I was discovering what it was like to be pure, to be truly pure. Well, that's when I heard the voice. It said, "Ralph, didn't you know that I would baptize you with fire?" And then the fire was gone. And appearing below me, far below, I saw an incredible kingdom stretching out seemingly forever. The intensity of the colors and the smells and even the tastes in the air was somehow something I could perceive, and it was incredible. Beholding this kingdom was the most marvelous experience I'd ever had. And that's when I realized that I was being carried down in the arms of an angel. The angel looked at me and smiled and said, "It ain't much, but we call it home." Sometime later, as I found myself embraced within this incredible realm, my heart was drawn back to those souls above. I asked someone, "What about them?" A big grin appeared on her face as she said, "You know, they all get here eventually. All of us started out up there. Some of us were even there for quite a long time. It's hard, you know, when you feel like you know everything there is to know. It's hard to allow new truth into your heart and to let it change you. But eventually they get sick and tired of pretending. They get tired of their own arrogance and find themselves on the shore of the lake of love." "Lake of love?" I said. "I experienced it, but I still can't believe it." "Watch your lips," she told me, "or we may have to send you back up to hell." I said, "You can do that, but I'll jump into that lake of fire so fast it'll be like quicker than lightning to catch me." She just chuckled and said, "You know, that's the problem with you ingrates. Once you've experienced the love, there is no kind of hell anywhere that scares you ever again." And Jesus said, "Amen." Some people believe that the message of the book of Revelation is that some people go up and some people go down. But as I hope you've seen in the previous weeks, and you will see in the coming weeks, the vision of Revelation is actually quite the opposite. It's that all people eventually make it there. But none of us make it there without being changed. None of us make it there without having all that burdens us and all the way that we burden others relieved of us, burnt in the fire of the refiner's fire of the Spirit. In light of that message, perhaps this ancient ritual of the imposition of ashes might be seen in a different light. These are not simply the ashes of our remorse for our sins, but rather the ashes that mark our step towards freedom, from being unburdened, from being beings where there is nothing left of us but love. Those who so wish at this time, I invite you to come down the center aisle and receive the ashes of freedom. Now, my friends, may the Spirit of the living God, made known to us most fully in Jesus Christ our Lord, go before you to show you the way, go above you to watch over you, go behind you to push you into those places you may not necessarily go yourself, go beneath you to uphold you and uplift you, go beside you to be your strong and constant companion, and dwell within you to remind you that you are surely not alone in this journey. You are loved, loved beyond your wildest imagination. And may the fire of God's blessing burn brightly upon you and within you and through you, now and always.